session on community, food, nature and land. I'm hoping that we'll be joined by one of our panelists online from Western Tanzania. I think we might be having slight technical issues, so if that happens, I'm going to introduce him anyway in the hope that he pops up on screen at any moment. I'm your chair for today's session, and I'm Ollie Douglas. I'm curator at the Museum of English Rural Life, which is part of the University of Reading. And if you think it's a little strange that a museum curator from a rural museum in Reading is chairing this session, I'll give you a very brief explanation of how the session came about, and that might or might not make sense. In 2023, I was lucky enough to travel to Kenya and Tanzania as part of a couple of projects, one of which focuses on knowledge restitution and conversations about contested heritage that lies in the Pitt Rivers Museum here in Oxford, and that's the Living Cultures project, and I'd encourage you to go online and find out more about that. Our fourth panellist, who may join us online, is Samwel Nangiria, and he was intimately involved in the instigation of that project. Whilst I was there, I was also looking into some colonial heritage that connects the history of the museum where I work and curate collections with British colonial interventions in East Africa in the mid-century period. So during that period, I became particularly interested in land and various contested notions of land, arguments about nature, protection, and was interested in the parallels between there and the UK. National parks were formed in East Africa at around the same time that national parks were formed in the UK, but they take a very different approach. So drawing on that, I convened a session called Conversations About Land, which Samwel attended, and someone from the Foundation for Common Land, Sam Caraway, who was working on a project about upland commons at the time, came along to that session, and he twisted my arm and said, you have to do a session at the Oxford Real Farming Conference because it's an amazing group of people, and my experience today has been that that is the case. So this session owes its origins to Sam Caraway, who submitted the proposal. I helped him convene and corral a group of interested people to be involved in the session. Then Sam moved jobs. So instead of Sam chairing coherently, you get me today doing my best in his absence. Sam's gone on to work on a project about nature in towns and cities that's, I think, a partnership between the National Trust and Natural England. So, you know, do chase up on that if those are themes that interest you. I'm sure Sam would love to hear from you. The structure for today's session is that we're going to do 5-minute provocations from each of our panellists. Then we'll have a bit of discussion amongst ourselves, and then towards the end of the session we'll open to the floor, both in the room and online, and hopefully draw you into the core of this discussion as well. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our panel in no particular order. Samwel Nangiria Taresero, who's hopefully going to appear on that screen at some point on his mobile phone, is a Maasai land activist and community leader. He's been integral in drawing together traditional Maasai leadership, an organization called the Orkiama, which was banned under British rule, and has recently been sort of brought back together to help in campaigning for better rights for pastoralist communities in East Africa. And obviously he's been involved in those projects with the Pitt Rivers that I mentioned. We also have on our far right JC Niala, who's a writer, a fellow curator at the Museum of the History of Science here in Oxford, an artist, a poet, you name it, JC's done it. She's also an anthropologist by training as well, and has written extensively on allotments. So she'll be here sort of representing that conversation about what she refers to as utopic city spaces, growing spaces that are more urban, perhaps smaller scale, but she's also done work on that in Kenya as well. And if she's willing, if Sam doesn't turn up, she's very kindly agreed to talk a little bit to the pastoralist community as well. Beside JC, we have Atenchong Nkobou, who I first met when he was just coming to the tail end of his PhD in Reading, where I work and where he studied. He's now based at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester, and I'm very pleased to say he's maintained connections with the Museum of English Rural Life and sits on our advisory board, and also brings his students across periodically to visit me and listen to me talking about various things to do with agricultural heritage. Atenchong has an Environmental and Social Research Council project running at the moment, which is about, it's called Reversing the Gaze, and I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about it, but it's essentially about global south or global majority ideas and philosophies around land, and how we might learn from those, and also from community land management projects here in the UK as well. So it's all about knowledge sharing and sort of bridging those global conversations and local conversations as well. And last but not least, we have James Norman sitting immediately to my right. James is an organic farmer, farms a herd of pasture-fed beef cattle in South Oxfordshire, so he's very much the local. And he's been farming there, I think, for 26 or 27 years. He undertook a conversion to the world of organics very early in his agricultural career, and I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about that. But he also farms, he's a tenant farmer on an estate called the Hardwick Estate, which I'd urge you to look up because they're doing interesting things about community land management and control. It's a really interesting estate. But he's a very passionate advocate for nature-friendly farming as well as being a district councillor for the Green Party and a member of the Chilterns Conservation Board. So he's vastly knowledgeable about a whole range of things that I am not. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James first, I think, to introduce us to how he became interested in organics and maybe how it connects to some of these themes of community, land, nature and food. James, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. Did you say that our bits are called provocations?
I think they're provocations. I don't know.
I
call them provocations.
I'll try and be provocative, yeah. And if I can. And this is a very cosy space, probably more comfortable for you than us because we've got very bright lights looking at us, so we can just about see you anyway. By way of introducing myself, I'm going to start with a famous quote because it kind of sets the scene for my worldview. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I'm sure most of you recognise that. Ollie has actually said much of what I was going to say, but yes, I'm a farmer. I have the good fortune to be a tenant farmer on the wonderful Hardwick Estate in South Oxfordshire. This is at the very southern end of the Chilterns, where the hills fall down to the Thames floodplain. So the farm is partly up on the Chilterns, partly down the Chalk Hills and partly on the Thames floodplain. The farm has been organic for 50 years this year, so it was one of the very first organic farms. And partly as a result of that, partly for other historic reasons, it has exceptional natural capital, exceptional nature, both in the number of the diversity of habitats and the diversity of species there. I've been there for 26 years, and the system I run there is that 3/4 of the farm is permanent pasture of various kinds. Floodplain hay meadows, fens, chalk grassland, and several other different kinds of grassland, a huge diversity of grassland types. That supports a suckler herd of Hereford cattle, that is, for non-farmers, a herd of cows who have a calf each year and rear them until the next calves are due. The cattle spend their entire lives on the farm. As well as being organic, the farm is certified as pasture-fed, which means the cattle eat pasture and hay, nothing else at all. I'm personally a fanatic for hay rather than silage. I never make silage. The grazing management is what I refer to as traditional rotational grazing. That is, the herd goes into a field, and then when it's been grazed off, they move to another field. So each field is grazed for maybe a week and then gets maybe 6 to 8 weeks rest. That's known as traditional rotational grazing, as opposed to mob grazing, which has sort of stolen the limelight. I have the cattle are housed in the winter for about 4 months, fed naturally on hay. I've been running cattle for 35 years now, and I've never used any vaccines, wormers, or supplements of any kind, and we have very, very low vet bills. The other quarter of the farm is in an organic arable rotation, which is a fairly conventional organic arable rotation. 2 years red clover lays, cut for hay, of course, and also grazed. Then 3 or 4 years cropping, including wheat, oats, beans, and unusually hemp, which we probably won't talk about today. The arable land gets all the farmyard manure, so the fertility there is very high. The grassland gets none and doesn't appear to need any. The whole system is very simple, with almost no external inputs at all, is generally very productive in most ways, and has fantastic biodiversity as measured by plant and bird species. We have good records of plant species, and we will have good records of bird species. So why do I farm to organic and pasture-fed standards? I find this difficult to explain, despite or perhaps because these two ideas are so fundamental to the way I think, and also because we aren't here to explore those particular ideas in any depth today. I'm sure they'll be explored in other sessions in this conference. I didn't come from a farming background. I went to agricultural college in the late 70s, a very well-known agricultural college, where organic farming and indeed nature conservation were never mentioned. The week I left, I happened to come across a box of Soil Association magazines. I read them in a day, and by the end of the day, I was, in my mind, an organic farmer. It just seemed obvious to me. I had no farm or any prospect of one. In fact, I didn't get my own farm to run until 11 years later, but I would claim I joined the organic movement that day. That was 45 years ago, and I've never for a single second doubted that organic is the only way to farm, not only for me, but for the whole world. My life's other idea, pasture-fed, obviously not my own original ideas, came much later, as it did for most of us, when we read Graham Harvey's excellent book, The Carbon Fields, in my case, in about 2013. Again, it just seemed blindingly obvious, and although I fed very little grain anyway to my cattle, I just gave it up, and my cattle have done just fine ever since. These two ideas are really my belief system, but I would say a well-evidenced belief system. It's not, we don't like organic farming to be thought of as a religion. It's an evidence-based farming system. We know that modern farming is not remotely sustainable for a whole host of reasons, and organic is the only holistic approach to farming land use. The particular mixed farming system I have suits my particular farm, but I think it is a suitable model for world farming, something that I am trying to write a book about. Our food should come from organic crops, but in a mixed farming system where the fertility, the soil health, comes from grazing animals on species-rich pasture. And that, of course, would give us the high-quality protein we need in the form of meat, milk and meat. I have one more point. I jokingly said I've had these two ideas in my life, but really these are underpinned by something much more fundamental, which is nature. Every farmer, every grower, every pastoralist, and indeed every gardener manages a piece of the world. Just think of that. I manage a part of the world. I can never get over that. What an incredible honour and an incredible responsibility. Everyone who manages land should think of it as a sacred duty, a duty above all to nature, but also, of course, to humanity and to the future.
Thank you, Jane. I should now, in the running order in front of me, be handing over to Samwel, who would be talking about Maasai homeland, past, present and future. I think if he were here, he would probably be reflecting on the impact of sort of the divisive impact of British colonial and German colonial rule in terms of dividing up Maasai communities, sort of breaking those community links physically through land divisions, stopping people from being able to share and herd cattle. He would also probably be talking a little bit about fortress conservation and the impact that the protection of wildlife and large tracts of land to the exclusion of people has had both historically and continues to have. So very recently, people from Sam's own community in Loliondo in Western Tanzania blocked the road to the Serengeti National Park and to Ngorongoro to try and make a point about the expansion of those spaces, often fed by external funding from other parts of the world, to the benefit of tourism, potentially to the benefit of wildlife, but certainly to the exclusion of and indeed the punishment of local pastoralist communities. I won't talk any more about Sam's, just in case Sam joins us at some point. I'm still holding out hope. But I will hand over to you, Atenchong, because you're actually doing some work with people in Loliondo as part of your Reversing the Gaze project, and perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that. And
I think I'll just start with that provocation word. And my Reversing the Gaze project has an element of provocation in that it tries to alter and destabilize the direction of knowledge or research or knowledge production generally, in the sense that the way we conceptualize the project is to have experts from the so-called Global South interrogate community land struggles in Scotland, not in a colonial sense, but to make visible knowledge struggles that could emerge from the experiences of communities in Scotland, fighting against market-led property regimes, and ultimately trying to build deep coalitions through conversations. And I think if Samwel were here, he will find very much similarity in James's cattle rearing experiences with those of the Maasai community, which is purely natural and dependent on nature.
It's probably worth reflecting that Sam actually came to the UK last year and met James's cattle and spent some time there. So
yeah, and I think when James is talking about organic being the world's mode of farming, I think Sam will very much agree with that and find lots of similarities in his own experiences, although the material and everyday experiences could be different because of structural differences in these countries. So ultimately what my project is really trying to do is to really say the capital, just to summarize it and make it very simply, is that capital really doesn't care whether you're in the global north or the global south. They would grab the land regardless of where you are. And the experiences that communities face in Scotland resonate to some degree with the experiences of communities in Loliondo. And unfortunately, the solutions that we are proposing as well in terms of nature-based solutions against so-called climate change or so-called biodiversity are being captured as well by capital to exclude communities of the very land that they are meant to protect. And when they do so, they disarm us of the language that we use to protect our land, and we begin to struggle to find commonality of even ground, because if we try to protect the land using the very language, it's like we are doing something wrong. We are challenging biodiversity and bioconservation because it has been co-opted by capital, and we are the bad guys. So I think as a society and as a community of farmers, of progressive academics, we should find a language that is not easily captured by capital and that we could own across borders, because it's currently extremely fragmented. But capital isn't fragmented. Capital is global. Capital is universal. And the fragmented nature maintains the status quo. So we have to find ways to build deep coalitions across borders, across knowledge structures, and find ways to reclaim language within climate change, within biodiversity, and own it, and use more radical ways, I think. We have so many niceties in the room, in the conference. We need to be more radical. In a summary, that is my project. I always wonder why it was funded, but it received funding.
I think what Atenchong is not telling you is that it was politely declined by the Arts and Humanities Research Council when it was framed as something more about the arts and humanities, and then it was enthusiastically taken up by the Environmental and Social Research Council. So there's something quite powerful in that, I think, in the shifting ways in which we frame some of these conversations, which for me as a museum curator, sort of with my head in heritage and the past, is quite significant. I need to think about framing that heritage to be part of contemporary debate and conversation as well. And I think that's very much part and parcel of the work that you've done, JC. So if I could bring you in to sort of give us your provocations and thoughts on some of these themes as well, that would be wonderful.
Yes. I mean, my interest in heritage is very much in the everyday. I guess if we're sticking with the provocation theme, I'll start with the fact that the vast majority of us in the world live in cities. Africa is the last continent where there's still more people in rural areas than in urban areas, but that's changing very rapidly as well. And I suppose I will start, because I'm talking about the everyday quite personally, when I think about my practice, which is about access. So like most people, I grew up in a city, but I grew up really with the ancestors always with us. And we all share a common ancestor in the land. And even though it was a city upbringing, we had a cow, we had goats, we had sheep in the garden, we had a vegetable garden. And so that was, because that's very much the heritage that I grew up around. You wake up in the morning, you milk the cow, you collect the eggs from the chicken. And I didn't understand this idea that nature was something out there, because nature was something in and where we lived. It was part of what we did. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect, my Luo community have a very different view to land rights, particularly as a woman. Our land rights begin actually in the womb. They carry on throughout our lives, and they carry on even after we die. So the understanding that somehow that we could be separate from the land and separate from nature, even if we lived in a city, didn't really occur to me. And it wasn't until I began to carry out my doctoral research on urban gardening sites, mainly allotments and guerrilla gardening sites in the city of Oxford. And I spent 36 months with growers who were doing this, that I realized, even though it had felt very specific to my context, allotmenteers, guerrilla gardeners were exactly the same in their connections with the land. I was growing alongside people who had been allotmenteers their whole life, the old boys that were much beloved on allotments, whose fathers were also old boys, maybe known for wearing flat caps and might hold their trousers up with bale of twine and were allotmenteering during the Second World War. Others, their grandfathers, who might have been allotmenteering during the First World War. And there was this very intimate connection that spoke to a much deeper history where allotments started in rural areas and then migrated to urban areas with people. We think of nature sometimes in a very static way, or plants in a static way, but they move with us. People came into the city with their allotments. And allotmenteering, as we speak of ancestors, also has a common ancestor, even though that would not have been the word they would have used at the time, in guerrilla gardening. When we think about the diggers or the levelers, and Gerald Winstanley, when he was there on St. George's Hill in Surrey and said, the earth must be a common treasury for all, and began to grow without permission, reclaiming land that had been enclosed and arguing that we are part of this land and we must not be separated from it. And what I found fascinating on the allotments across Oxfordshire was that they were doing something that governments have failed to do. We have governments telling us that we must get on with each other. We must be multicultural in cities. They come up with policies and ideas about how to make that work. These things have struggled. We're facing some of the falling out of that now. But on allotments, they're more diverse in people and plants than the cities that surround them, quietly. People grow alongside and exchange with each other. I've been on allotment sites where people have ended up growing vegetables from parts of the world they had never previously even heard of. And when I asked allotmenteers, why are you growing these plants? They said, because we love them. And so there was so much love that I encountered for the plants, for the people they were growing alongside, and through the land. In my Luo community, we have a similar system to allotments in that women would have their pieces of land. I've spoken briefly about the land rights. But what would happen, because I must say that we also really like to have a good time. So what would happen is that each woman would, maybe there's a group of 10 women in a village, and all 10 would work on one plot and then the next plot. But what would happen after the work had been finished is we'd brew a thing called busa, which is a kind of fermented porridge, and there'd be a party. So the great thing is all plots got worked on, and if there were 10 women, there were also 10 parties. The same thing actually happens in the UK, but in a slightly different way. During the lockdowns, amazing things happened on allotment sites across Oxford. If there was somebody who was shielding, and if there was somebody who couldn't get to their plot neighbour would look after their plot for them. But what was even more powerful is you might have somebody who was a no-dig allotmentier growing next to somebody who was a conventional allotmentier. The conventional allotmentier would practice no-dig gardening when they were working on their neighbour's plot. It meant that they had been watching each other. It meant that they had been exchanging ideas. And they could do it when they needed to for the person they cared for, even if their own practice was different. I was powerfully moved by that. And by thinking about all of the little accommodations that people made for each other in the everyday. I'm going to close with a story of a woman who lost her job just before the lockdowns. And at the same time, she had just got her first plot, and she was very excited about this plot. She was in precarious work, like many people in cities are. And because it was the beginning of the growing season, and I don't know if you remember, it was a spectacular growing season that year. But of course, she hadn't had time to really prepare the plot. And of course, other allotmentiers were realizing what was going on with her. And most allotments have places where you can put your excess. And what's wonderful about these places is it avoids shame and it avoids obligation. You can go and take excess and not knowing who put it there, nobody seeing you taking it, you don't feel like you have to give back. She told me she ate the best food she had ever eaten in her life as she was waiting for her own crops to grow because she was able to help herself to what her fellow allotmentiers had left for her. So I would like to end this provocation would be to ask you all, in your practice, whether it's a growing practice, whatever your practice is with land, what are the ways in which those connections remain nurtured through the land, and those connections that can cut across time and space and any superficial differences that we might see between each other? Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm sorry I threw provocations at you without having mentioned that at all. It's almost like we hadn't planned this, but we did in fact have a conversation. So that's a beautiful segue to the question that I'd quite like to ask our other panellists, JC, about knowledge exchange. So you're talking there about allotments as these amazing sites for sort of sharing knowledge and sharing practice, both visually as well as verbally, and crossing cultural boundaries as well. And I wonder whether, James, you might comment on what the methodologies and contexts that you've encountered that are most powerful for knowledge exchange around some of the ideas that you're interested in to do with land and nature and food production. What are the most powerful ones? Where have you gained your knowledge and where have you shared your knowledge, and how do you do that?
So I started from a zero base, as I was actually a Birmingham vicar's son. So I knew nothing at all, but I went to work on farms. So my knowledge base really started from working on farms and going to agricultural college. But if you mean in the present context, all of us who started organic farming, almost everybody, I think, would use an organic advisor. The fact there was only one, and he's a legend in the organic world, and we relied very heavily on him for his advice. And throughout the period, I still have an organic advisor to this day, although I don't need them very much, but I certainly do need them. In the present context, really, the organic world has these wonderful publications, the Soil Association magazine and the Organic Research Centre bulletins, which sort of keep us up to date with developments and research and so on. But one of the most powerful knowledge exchanges that I have currently is actually the Pasture for Life Google group, the only social media that I have. And is a very supportive, inclusive, sort of open-minded and wonderful group, and that has been like another sort of home, I think, really, in the recent period.
Yeah. I mean, I went to a session earlier today about some of the polarizing challenges of social media and how it amplifies maybe the more extreme perspectives. But I think when the technology works, sadly not today for us, but when it does work, and it's an amazingly empowering tool for conversation. Atenchong, what about you in terms of knowledge exchange? That's a key part of essentially the project you're working on is about those stakeholder engagements, isn't it?
I think it's extremely important that people speak to each other, and as researchers or as an academic, there is usually within academic spaces to think that being a researcher means you're producing knowledge, which I struggle to reconcile myself with. I usually see myself as a facilitator, as a curator of expertise on the ground, wherever the field is. And what we do basically in our everyday life or everyday research activity is to go to these communities, harvest knowledge, and brand it in our own exotic ways, which is a kind of extraction in itself. So the way I see myself within my own project is how can I bring these experts in their own rights together to build, again, I use the term deliberately, deep coalitions among these very, very strategic teams and ideas, and ensure that we are challenging the same structure or deconstructing or dismantling the same structure within a market-led political economy of land regimes or land ownership. And I think there are material evidences. So the same person who buys a piece of land in Westeros, Scotland, is the same person excluding Maasai pastoralists from Liliondo, Tanzania. So that is a real material connection in terms of the way capital is structured. And so if you bring people within these communities together, I think the impact is higher and the impact is more profound. And I think more of that needs to be done to challenge the status quo and to get results in terms of knowledge exchange and knowledge building as an exercise. And it's not to find commonality or to have a homogeneous society, which is a very, very dangerous goal to pursue. I think it's about learning how to thrive in difference and learning how to learn and accept difference, but also building coalitions within the difference that we find in our ways of life or in our everyday experiences, as JC was articulating.
Do you think those coalitions are broader than just people, though? I'm struck by JC's observations about plant diversity and nature within city spaces, and I'm just remembering bringing Sam to visit you, James, and the point of connection you had was actually when we were standing in a field patting your bull, which was a bit terrifying, and much larger than I think Sam's bull is at home. But the conversation that you had around cattle was facilitated in part by the cattle being there, and the conversations we were having about nature were about those sort of more than human participants in that conversation, if that makes sense. I mean, they weren't obviously speaking, but we were, talking about them, and in some ways for them. Is that a key part of this? I mean,
I would say where cattle are concerned, there is neither east nor west, or in this case, neither north nor south. But yes, any. I mean, I've worked in other countries somewhat, and the language of people who work the land is a common one. It's a very strong bond in wherever I've been. Even if the language is a barrier, it's amazing how you can overcome that. Not that it was a barrier in this case, but I have found that in other parts of the world.
Is that an echo of the same thing that you experienced in your field work, JC?
Very much so, and also just the little joys that come out of unexpected connections in that way. So when you're talking about cattle, I'm thinking about there was an old boy on one of the allotment sites that I was on who was growing pumpkins. He was very good at growing pumpkins, but it wasn't until his son brought his daughter-in-law to the site, and she was like, "Oh, but I'm from Zimbabwe and we eat pumpkin leaves." And so now he doubly wanted to grow more pumpkins so his daughter-in-law could have the pumpkin leaves. But it was that which, otherwise he was like, "Oh, I never did anything with the pumpkin leaves. It was, I was just growing it for the pumpkins." But it's not a forced thing, I think. It is that material engagement, how you do things in one way, what you learn through the different ways of doing things. But also speaking to that difference and respecting that difference and knowing that, okay, that might not be the way I choose to do it, but I can see how it works for that person as well.
So for those of you who are at the plenary session, some of those words that we kicked off with were very powerful in that sense, and I think there were shared connections to those words, whatever perspective and angle you're coming from at this conference. Atenchong.
Yeah, just to add, it also has something to do with to what we perceive as. I'm speaking in terms of land valuation, for example. What do we value within the discourse of the political economy of land ownership? And in many cases, especially with land reform in Scotland, for example, what you need to evidence is the economic benefit of what it means to own land. And I think the benefit goes beyond that. It goes to the connection, for example, that you have with the cattle or with the allotment, which are sometimes not tangible and cannot be quantified in economic terms. Yeah. And I think we need to bring that into the conversations. What does it mean to have these nature-based elements around us, and how do we value it based on community principles, not just on market-led principles? And I think that is what enriches the conversations that James and Sam will have, as opposed to a land valuator and Sam and James. And they may not see eye to eye because their conceptions of the value of what is in front of them in terms of the cattle or the allotments are completely different. They see something else when they see the cattle, which is not captured by the way the valuator captures the value of the cattle itself. And I think it's important that we bring these elements into our conversation and we show that they have a strong relationship with what it means to be human or what it means to live with nature.
Economic value alone is only one measure, and I think it really flattens what the benefits are. There's Ashby who did a survey of allotments in the 1920s in Oxford, and he wrote a very similar thing. He said allotments cannot be based on, the value of allotments cannot be purely economic. And if I think about the number of people I met who told me about the mental health struggles that they had that were cured, and cured is the words that they were using, from engaging with their allotments, the transformations that they had, that's not something I think you could even measure in economic terms. By the time you decide to start saying, okay, let's look at how much it would have cost the NHS, it's about that individual experience and the way that the agency is resting with the person, with the allotmenteer, and what they're able to, and the benefits that stretch far beyond just, an economic figure about treating somebody.
Yeah, I think we've all missed Steve Reed talking at the other conference today, but very much the emphasis was on that market-based sort of neoliberal view of farming practice in the words that he chose to share with those delegates. And I think there's a major challenge in there. I was going to pick up on something that you were talking about, Atenchong, which was about the the degree to which capital cares, and whether it, you sort of went on to hint at this, but about the degree to which capital cares about nature as well. How can we balance some of these things? And is community, are these conversations, these knowledge exchange points, are they the way forward? Is that the answer to counterpoint the degree to which capital is dominating these things, and that question of economic value? James, you have these struggles, I think, as a tenant farmer. I mean, I'm thinking quite marginal existence for the tenant farmers I know, at least. The economic value is obviously important, but
yeah. So I can't help with the question of how we. I think the question was directed at Atenchong about how capital can be, as it were, channeled in beneficial ways. But I can say that the situation for access to land in the UK is very poor. The vast majority of farmers are on of tenant farmers are on farm business tenancies, which are freedom of contract and essentially very short, no security. And I'm incredibly lucky, by the way. I have a very supportive landlord, and on paper I have no security, but I have a relationship and so on. This is very. I just want to compare Britain and France. So in Britain, when people make a fortune in business or whatever they make, one of the things they do, and have always done actually, is to go and buy an estate, sometimes several estates. This actually goes back centuries. But, and they still do this today, partly for status reasons, but also because of because it is a good investment. And there is, famous examples, which we won't name because I don't want to be sued, but of people making a fortune in business, a very large fortune, and then going and buying 25,000 acres of farmland. So that is not because they care about farming or land or anything to do with it. It's simply because it's an asset class, and they can pass it on, and they can avoid capital gains tax and so on. At the same time, farmers or landowners who are lucky enough to get development planning permission on their land, which increases its value approximately 50 times, can avoid capital gains tax by buying more farmland, and that has driven the farmland market. So the farmland market is way, way beyond what anyone investing in farming to farm it could afford to do. I just want to contrast this with France. So in Britain, the capital rules, if you like, and has dominated the land market for a very long time and makes it way beyond the reach of ordinary farmers. In France, they take a completely different sort of more statist, socialist approach, where if you want to buy a farm, you have to be approved by the local agricultural committee. At one time I was looking at farms in France and I knew about this. I don't know if it's still the same, but I presume it is. And they won't let you buy it unless you're a farmer. So you have to have shown that you are actually going to farm it yourself. You have to have the education or the background to so on. And that controls it. As a result, farmland in France is about 1/10 the price of what it is in Britain.
How does that compare to Tanzania, Atenchong?
Just to go back, starting with the question of capital, I don't think capital and love for nature can be found in one sentence. I think capital thrives on extracting, because the very nature of capital is to make profit, or to extract by every means necessary what is left within the system to make profit, and that's how capital is by nature. Following the 2007-2008 financial crisis, Tanzania went through the same experience where venture capitalists, I think this was also provoked by the EU's focus on biofuel policy. At the time, they had transitioned or introduced the transition to biofuels, which meant that more land was needed to grow this magic crop. At the time, it was jatropha, which was seen as the main crop that will revolutionize, change the whole system. But this was also a very perennial crop which failed. So many venture capitalists speculated on land and bought huge chunks of land to grow this crop in in Tanzania. At the time, the government also moved towards this, they call it the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, which coincidentally is the same area with the groundnut scheme during Attlee's regime after the Second World War, which also failed.
We can come back to the groundnut scheme.
But anyway, but that is how capital works. So they speculate. There's also an interesting story of people buying land in Tanzania and using it as collateral in their local or home banks, for example, in the United Arab Emirates, for example. So people could speculate, buy a land there and use that as collateral to get loans from banks, which was a perverse nature of capital and to its extreme. So I don't think capital will do anything nice about preserving nature. I think they will co-opt the language that we in this room are trying to articulate and see how to use that language to make more profit from the very nature that we are trying to protect, or that James and Samwel are trying to protect in their everyday life, or the allotment people are trying to protect. So capital will always find ways, and we as a community need to find ways of challenging that more overtly and more powerfully, I think. How we do that is left for us to design, but I think it has to be with strong coalition building and strong knowledge exchange.
Yeah. JC, did you have any reflections on that? Or?
I mean, I think, I get my hope again from allotments, because we have the 1908 Allotment Act, which made allotments a statutory right in this country, which is not the same in a lot of European countries with allotments. Places like Belgium, for example, it's not a statutory right. And particularly for urban allotments, I mean, these are radical spaces. If you think about some of the locations of allotments in the city of Oxford and what that land is actually worth in terms of real estate, and there's cabbages growing on it. I mean, how wonderful, And so it's really about making sure that we exercise and engage with that right. Many people don't realize, and this is Section 23 of the 1908 Allotment Act, that if 6 people from different council tax-paying households approach the council because there's too much of a waiting list in your area, you have the right to demand allotments. Now, yes, it's not a straightforward process, but you do have that right. And I have met people who have started allotments that way. Some, it took only as little as 18 months. And the great thing about it is once you have started it, it's not just going to be the 6 of you, there will be space for other people as well. But it does require that everyday engagement. It does mean, as you said, these deep coalitions. And it does mean working with plural people who might do things very differently, but that's what it'll make it even stronger.
There's a connection there between allotments and the context within which you farm, James, in that it's not about owner-occupied land. And I think that might be a critical component of this. In Tanzania, I think I'm right in thinking land is leasehold for the most part. Yeah. So that question of fundamental ownership of land runs right through the heart of this. I mean, maybe that's the key to circumventing capital, is circumventing that system. If one can. In Kenya, across the border from Loliondo in Narok County in the Loita Hills, they have last year enclosed and privatized land. So we're sitting in a context where, for the most part, land was enclosed and privatized, apart from a few common areas that we're still arguing about and debating about and having to push for rights of access to. But for the most part, land was enclosed in England hundreds of years ago, if not several hundred years ago. But that's still happening in many parts of the world, that following that model of privatizing and enclosing land. And it's very destructive, both to livelihoods and to nature. I mean, I think elsewhere in Kenya, JC, you might be able to comment on this, that's caused quite widespread environmental harm, hasn't it, that process? I
mean, hugely, because, I'm always really kind of taken aback by this sort of, the animals are in the wrong place, or the people are in the wrong place. Fences, which are incredibly artificial constructs, Speaking very personally, because borders are just another type of fence. On my mother's side of the family, the Kenya-Uganda border literally goes through her village. So you have a situation where you have one family, and depending on where you were born, you might end up being Kenyan or Ugandan. So these really bizarre artificial constructs that we then expect nature to somehow adhere to, and then are shocked and horrified. When I was looking at the history of the development of Nairobi National Park, you had, various settlers who were complaining that, the zebras were munching their flowers, and what were they doing there? And it's kind of like, you've just put up a random fence. These are ancient routes through which animals have been passing, and people also have been passing for centuries. So we don't really seem to have this idea right about how we should engage with the way in which land is shared, not just amongst human beings, but also all the creatures that we live with.
I had an interesting conversation with Samwel, and he told me that in Maasai culture, when they talk about mapping, they are not talking about borders. They are talking about learning profound relationships with nature and knowing when to engage and when not to engage, and building that relationship better. So it's about sharing the same space with nature. That's what mapping means for a Maasai, in the Maasai context. It's really not about borders or boundaries or creating artificial landmarks. So I think that is important. We need, and I think the reason why privatization of land keeps on expanding is because we are not interested in talking about different systems that work, and we use language like alternative or radical, again, to keep these approaches or to maintain them at the margins, which is a question of language. We cannot keep on calling regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, alternative systems of farming as if they can't be main system of farming. I think we need to take away the word alternative and call them farming systems. Doing so maintains the status quo, because it means these are marginal ways of doing stuff. And I don't also think we need to incentivize landowners to give land, because using the word incentive carries with it a kind of hierarchical power structure, like cajoling somebody who has aggressively taken away land to give back land that you owned in the first place. It must be a different use of language. We must reclaim language. We must construct our approach to these challenges in different ways, and be willing and be vulnerable to accept that we are. It's not because we like it, but we are forced to because of the current nature of the climate. I mean, political structures are falling before our eyes. The climate is in a dire state. We have no choice but to change the way we do stuff, and I think we have to start now.
I think very true. I want to think a little bit about access to spaces, partly because I think some of what you've all been talking about is it's only through having that access and connectivity to land that we can become more sympathetic to nature and its needs, rather than perhaps just to our own capitalist needs. So I wonder whether you might all reflect a little bit on that. I think that there's obviously somewhere else in the conference right at the moment. There's a conversation going on about right to roam with some of the right to roam organisation members. I think you live next door to Nick Hayes, James, so he's one of the key figures in that movement, author of the Book of Trespass, and I think you've spoken to him recently about that. But you also reflected to me a little bit about, people accessing your farm and how that happens and what the value of that is.
Yes, so I met Nick a number of years ago, and he's the great advocate of in the modern era of the right to roam. I mean, the movement goes back much further. I state quite plainly that I believe in universal public access, which is unusual among farmers, and I don't think it's just because I'm a tenant. I think I believed that long ago. Yes. So right now there is a meeting going on somewhere else of an organisation called AFLO, I think, Access Friendly Farmers and Landowners. Now, in fact, I've only just heard of this, and I've just asked if I can join just a few days ago. I strongly believe that British people, perhaps uniquely, or at least to a greater extent than in any other country, have been divorced from land. There are historic reasons for this. The enclosures, the early industrial revolution, really, which means that most British people have lived in cities for over 200 years now. This is very different in most other European countries, and the debate now is really around, so this is a voluntary movement of farmers who want to give access, and that's fine. Now the debate is around coping with the problems of letting people in who have not felt they have a right to be there. In countries like Scandinavia, which I'm familiar with, and Germany, I believe, people have always had the right to go on most land, and so they feel it belongs to them in some sense. They don't feel this distance from it. They haven't been excluded from it, so they respect it. There is a feeling, certainly a fear among farmers, that if you give public access, that you'll have all kinds of problems with litter and dogs and gates being left open and damage to crops and this sort of thing. And I think this organisation is trying to have a debate about how to cope with those possible things. My view is access to land is essential to the nation's mental health. This is very much part of the Chilterns Conservation Board philosophy. It's built into it. And my feeling is the sooner we get on with giving people access to land so that these problems can be tackled and overcome, the better.
So we need legislative change on that front.
Yes, although I believe that is quite remote, really. Yeah. The government has already pissed off farmers royally in the last few weeks and may not be ready for another battle of that kind of apocalyptic nature. Some people may remember the Right to Roam campaigns of about 20 years ago, which did not go down well with the farming community. But this is a debate we need to have, and
anyone interested in that network, because you're here in this session and not in the other one. I think there was a piece in Wednesday's Guardian about some of the farmers who are involved in that, so it's worth checking that out. I wonder whether there's something. I grew up on a farm in the south of Scotland, so that the idea of not being able to access land is slightly different for me, and it's an unfamiliar feeling. And I feel quite comfortable in to some extent in trespass here in England, because I'm used to accessing farmland and being in those spaces. Do you think there's something in the connection with Scotland in relation to your project, Atenchong, and community land management and models of community cooperatives and different structures around land decision making that connects to those kinds of legislative differences? Or
in Scotland, there's the right to roam. It's not debatable in Scotland. There's this right to roam, and it exists, and people are making use of those rights in Scotland. Scotland has a more progressive attitude towards community land ownership. There is legislation that allows communities to preempt a sale or to be the first to be contacted if there's land available within the community. But there are also challenges within the model of community land ownership, which I, as somebody with experiences in the so-called Global South, has. So, for example, in Tanzania, what constitutes community? For example, a community of place, a village. This community village land, which is owned by every adult in the village above the age of 18. But in Scotland, it has to be an adequately constituted community, which is defined by a community of place and people who can meet up the market price of the land which is available for sale. So it's also based on, again, market principles determine who access or who doesn't access land, which is completely different from Tanzania. You also have crofters land, which is a form of almost similar to small-scale farming, but this is culturally different in Scotland. Crofters have their own right, but again, it's a form of private ownership based on indigenous and historical practices of crofting in Scotland. There are nuances and differences, and there are interesting contentions or contradictions from my own experiences in the Global South, which I'm learning and trying to explore. There are also different approaches of challenging private land ownership, because I think 423 people own 50% of rural land in Scotland, which is just unbelievable. Most of them foreigners as well, which is also an experience with Tanzania and Kenya and most of these countries. But there are different models of challenging this concentration of land ownership. So you have those who are struggling for the commons and those who are struggling for the community land ownership. These are two different approaches to challenging it. How do we... These people are struggling against the same enemy, but they seldom sit in the same room, whether crofters or those fighting for the commons or those fighting for community land ownership. They are working in silos most of the time. Is it possible to bring everyone together to say, how do we use our differences against the same structural challenges and enemies? It's beginning to happen. There's a Community Land Scotland Conference. There's a Community Land Academic Network, which is also just starting. So people are finding ways to do this in Scotland as well. And I think they are way advanced, unfortunately, than England, which is, I think, still very much behind in terms of sharing community spaces, I think. But the movement is coming to Scotland because there's now moved for, even though they are talking about community ownership, but it's mainly towards pubs and service provision, which could be a risk in itself, because it's a means of the government to transfer its legal responsibilities to communities to say, we are struggling and we don't want to impose austerity, and so maybe this is a way of bringing in community, which is a perverse way of, again, using the community land struggles in very perverse ways. And I think we should be cautious about that in England. But the debates are coming up in some ways in England as well.
I'm beginning to feel like JC's push for allotments might be a writ large approach to land wherever we are, because they sound like idyllic spaces to me. JC, did you have reflections on that from a Kenyan context? Because I know that you've been involved in a project in Kenya around horticultural practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think because you mentioned earlier the more than human, I think it's whenever we make space for nature, nature makes space for us. So I'll speak to Kenya in just a moment, but in Oxford, there are people, their neighbours who've taken the fence down between their gardens. And that completely transforms the space. It means people have, a much bigger garden that they share. On the flip side of that, the paving over of front gardens, which is a real problem. So we talk about, we want more nature in cities, but on a level it does start with us. And how we, the sacred duty that we have to manage, however small that piece of land is. Even thinking about balconies, it's amazing how balconies can transform an entire block of flats. Other people benefit from seeing that nature. So thinking about that. But in Kenya, definitely, a project I was involved with in an informal settlement. We started an organic farm. It was, at the time, I didn't know the term, but later I realized we guerrilla gardened it. It was land owned by Kenya Railways. And it was a farm that went on to feed 74 families. But it was making space for nature. It was a practical thing. There was a dump site. We cleared the rubbish. We planted sunflowers to heal the soil. They practiced sunflowers, carried out phytoremediation to remove the toxin, the heavy metals from the soil. But so for me, we've been talking about knowledge exchange between humans, but it's also that knowledge exchange between plants and people and animals. And the more space we make for plants, for animals, for different types of nature in cities, that will proliferate, and that will give us more of that interaction.
I think I'm very keen now to open up questions, but just before I do, I promised to explain the groundnut scheme. For those of you who don't know, the groundnut scheme is probably the biggest ever colonial agricultural failure. It was a scheme to cultivate vast tracts of, at that point, Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, for the cultivation of peanuts so that we could have peanut oil exported to Europe. It came to an end on the 1st of January 1951, which was the very day that the first object was accessioned into the museum that I now work in. So it's a strange sort of powerful day. And James referenced Graham Harvey. Graham Harvey was at one time agricultural advisor on The Archers. And The Archers, the first nationally broadcast episode of The Archers, came into being that same day as well. So it's a very significant day, and one that draws things together. I can't think of a 1951 January allotment narrative, JC. Maybe you've got something up your sleeve. I wonder whether we have any people involved in land co-ops or community land management models in the room who might be interested in asking a question of our distinguished panel.
Barbara Hines, and I've done work with...
Oh, can you wait? Are you happy to wait for the mic?
I beg your pardon, I forgot about these things. Yeah, Barbara Heinsohn. I've done work with people in East Africa since the late 1990s, and we were doing futures thinking, what will become of Kenya, Tanzania, so forth. And I was the only European for the most part. I was living in London at the time. And out of that, we started thinking, a Tanzanian friend, Aiden Ayukuza, and I ended up writing a paper called The Tension of Two Worlds. And it was really looking at what is the mindset that comes out of traditional African societies versus the mindset that comes out of contemporary Western societies. And it was a really interesting piece of work. And you get involved in the role of the spirit world and cosmologies and all sorts of the other things. But one of the things that came out very clearly was that there's a very different approach to land and land rights. And we ended up describing that as using, as I'm born in the US, the American model is that if you own a hectare of land, you own the air rights and the mineral rights and everything in between. It's a column of rights. In the African context, nobody owns that hectare, but everybody has rights to something on that hectare. So you can tell the difference between one system and another because a column rights map, if you're in an airplane, will be covered in fences. A mosaic rights view will be covered in footpaths. And when several years later, East African colleagues and I got together to start a project where we would learn from each other on how to create social ecological systems that support people who support the natural world, one of the things we agreed in 2009 was that mosaic rights were central to the future of land management and the relationship between people and land. And it's a change of language that we created. But I'm wondering if that change of language might possibly be helpful to what you were doing. Sorry, that's very long, and my apologies.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to others to respond.
You?
To that.
You want to? No, you go. No. Yeah, I'm very much interested in language, but also how do we ensure that that language is, again, not co-opted? Exposing or making, I'm using Bayo Akumulafe's thinking here. He's a Nigerian philosopher. We always, as researchers, want to make things legible and visible and expose nuances. And is there a danger of also exposing language as well, because it becomes a commodity in its own self? So I'm interested in ensuring that we, and also there's a way in which colonial or capitalist systems change meanings. For example, land. The meaning of land in local languages it's wholesome. It's different from just a piece of soil. And that is what it means within market-based system, just that soil. But in my local language, land it's different. You can't really articulate or put a touch on what it means if you have to do a direct translation to a colonial language like English. It means something more profound than just the soil. And so I think language is important. We must be conscious about language. We must be conscious about how dominant structures use language, but not to be consumed by it, but just to be aware by it and ensure that we keep it to ourselves and protect it religiously, I think.
I wonder whether the systems that you're talking about, one of them is about dividing up those landscapes in a way that cuts them into different parcels and portions, which reminds me of something that you were talking about to me the other day, James, that challenge of sparing and sharing. I wonder whether you might just explain some of that briefly before we move on to another question.
Well, that's a
Briefly.
that's a very large subject.
Yeah.
I'm an advocate of land sharing. That is to say, farming in ways that are beneficial and work with nature. The land sparing argument, almost widely, universally used by capital, by agribusiness, is to intensify everything, and they've come up with this wonderful reason for intensifying everything. Their real reason, of course, is to sell products, but they've come up with this wonderful reason that if you intensify agriculture, then you can spare some land somewhere in some mysterious place. Now, in fact, that argument is absolutely fallacious, because we now have the largest supply of food per head that the world has ever had, and at the lowest price, and still every moment we are destroying, the Amazon, the Sumatra and Java and so on. So if that argument was going to stack up, it would have already stacked up. So that's the land sharing rather than land sparing. Just on mosaic, just a brief point. As I understand, you mean like a stacking of rights. So different people have different kinds of rights, and that is a really powerful way of expressing that. And I'm just harking back slightly to the public access thing, where I feel incredibly privileged that I have 300 acres that I and my family and my landlord are the only people. I feel incredibly privileged that I can wander all over that every day and do whatever I like. But legally, nobody else can. And I think that's completely wrong. That's just goes against the grain. And I would like to share that with everybody, anybody who wants to come on it. I mean, there may have to be some boundaries to that because of nesting birds or because of livestock or that sort of thing. But as a general idea, I think we should be stacking a right of access. I mean, I would love to see a universal right to roam in England as well as in Scotland.
Perhaps you could share the citation with us afterwards, the paper. Yeah.
They're not very public. They're on a few websites.
Wonderful. I wonder if there are any questions online.
Yeah. So there's one, I guess, from Diana. And Diana asks, how can we use legislation like community land trusts and asset locks to protect those guerrilla and tenant spaces not protected like allotments?
That sounds like a question for either JC or Atenchong, I think.
Before you respond, because I think that's for you, using the law as a means to solve this issue, we also need to be. I'm sounding more like a serious skeptic about everything. But we must also understand that the law itself is used as a means to commodify land and labor. And that is just what I have to say. And that the law may not necessarily be the means through which we find solutions to these problems, except that we have to think outside the law as well to contribute to how we maybe build new legislations around current legal systems. But fundamentally, the law has been used to commodify land and labor. And just to leave it and you.
I think there's something about practice. I think we've seen from what everybody has been saying, the real issue becomes when you have people who are not at all connected to that land, who can use capital, so the land is not being engaged with, but it's being extracted from in terms of capital. So in terms of protecting, it's about all of our common engagement. So I'll come back to the example of the farm in the informal settlement in Nairobi. So after 10 years, this farm had been doing really well. Kenya Railways took the land back. But they recognised the work that had gone into that farm, and the group that I was working with, Youth Reform, were actually compensated for that loss and were able to get access to land elsewhere. So there is something about actually actively engaging with the land. It's when there's the disconnect that land becomes very vulnerable. There's no such thing as a kind of, I feel horrified when people talk about wasteland or empty land. There's no such thing. It's when there's the connection between people and that bit of nature that creates a value that can't be interfered with, even legally, as long as it's strong enough in that sense.
Ironically, the one person who has participated actively in a session in this panel before, in this conference before, hasn't been able to join us because of the technical challenges. So I wonder whether we might ask someone who hasn't participated before from the floor to ask a question.
Do I need the mic?
Yes, I think you do need the mic so that I think we need so that people can hear online. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jane. I'm from Common Flora, which is a small agro-ecological certified organic project in South Devon. We are sharing our small space with people who can't afford or an allotment, or who have not got a chance because the waiting list is so long, who are vulnerable in some way. So we've got like little plots amongst our trees. Common Flora, as the name suggests, we're about bringing people together. But my question is, there's the discussion about the Scottish land rights and land rights in Tanzania and Kenya. Are there networks and connections for land rights movements globally where people, I know there's La Via Campesina, but is it a functioning global inter-exchange of knowledge and support for each other?
I think there are organizations that work towards this. Land Workers Alliance, for example, Via Campesina, for example. And I think so many researchers as well in Scotland have done this before me. If you read Soil and Soul, Alistair McIntosh, for example, draws experiences from different geographies around the world. The Galgale Trust, for example, calling the pioneer of that community trust, also drew examples from indigenous communities in Canada. So there is a lot going on in terms of exchange. In terms of making it a global movement, to what extent is doing so is still a little bit limited vis-a-vis the scale of capital encroachment on community land ownership. And I think it needs to be scaled up further. That's the only challenge. How do we do that in a more overt and global scale? I think we have to really find devices and means in which we make that more visible.
Can we take a question from the middle there, the gentleman there?
Brilliant, thank you. I'm Drew, and I just wanted to ask JC, you mentioned the project that was in Kenya, was it, that was youth, it was a youth group, was it, that was doing the guerrilla gardening? I think that particularly was something I was wanting to ask about, is how to get more young people basically involved in these sort of questions, especially as so many young people have been alienated from nature, in a lot of the ways that they live and their lifestyles nowadays. I was involved in a project that was to do with a COP that was indigenous youth people that were from Colombia that were coming over to COP to just share their essentially their worries, about what the future meant for them, and their environments, just in the way the world is at the moment. And so is there other sort of thoughts you have on the sort of what best way to engage young people in these sort of matters?
Thank you for that question, and thank you all for your questions. I think it's about meeting them where they are. So when I talk about the farm in Kibera and Nairobi, I often start with the story of the farm, and it's all very lovely. But actually, of course, initially, Youth Reform, who I was working with, none of them had grown anything before. And they were like, farming? What? Really? And they had other business ideas. So we negotiated. I said I would fundraise for one of their business ideas if they were willing to try out the farm. And so it was a different type of exchange. And that's actually how it started. So it was very much meeting them where they were. And then it was over a period of time, I managed to organize organic farm training for them. That began to grow. And the really interesting thing happened where it wasn't just, the farm didn't just stay there. There was some, media interest. Some of the members of Youth Reform ended up traveling to places like Brazil, Rio, were in favelas there, sharing their experience. But also, again, this, rural-urban divide. So a group of farmers from Wales actually ended up coming to the farm in Nairobi, and they were going through a very interesting intergenerational period where they were worried that their children weren't interested in taking over family farms. So they thought they would come out and volunteer in Nairobi, and it did give them a sense of renewal, working with young people in Kenya, and gave them ways that they could think, that they were able to then take back to Wales with them. But I think it is really about meeting people where they are, finding out what that particular interest is, negotiating, and yes, working with the resistance, because there can be resistance. But I don't know. I do believe in the magic of the soil. Once people get their hands in it, something happens.
I think education is also key, and how we teach. So we need to use more inventive ways of teaching, arts, poetry, and I think so many indigenous communities, whether Gaelic or Maasai, are really entrenched in poetry and music and singing. And I think these ways, introducing these methods of teaching about agriculture and farming and land in the classroom can be useful in changing the way people's relationship with the land as well.
I do have one other thing that I wanted to say about that as well, because most recently I was in South Africa, in Cape Town, on the Cape Flats, which is a highly contested and very complex history of people being removed from the land. So I think also sometimes it's about the deep memory work and healing that has to be done. They might be young people, but they carry within them the trauma of their elders having been forcibly removed. And that has to be addressed head on and dealt with and listened to and worked with. Because I think sometimes there can be this great silence around some of these questions. And young people are very well aware of that. And it's about kind of working with these histories and peeling back the layers and being open to some of those incredibly painful and difficult conversations about why there's been this alienation, why there's been this loss, which, they're not going to learn in school. It's about actually facing it within the communities.
I think if we could have another question from online, if there are any.
So, from Felicity, what do you think about platforms such as Regen Network, which seek to find ways to direct that flat but high-value economic return back to communities?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Regen Network.
Okay.
What do you think about Regen networks?
I don't know much about
I don't know.
Are we talking about regional networks or regenerative?
Regen, then.
No, I don't know much about that.
I wonder whether I could put you on the spot, James, and ask you to comment on regenerative farming. I think it's part and parcel of that conversation we were having about sparing and sharing for you to some extent, isn't it?
Not sure how it links to that, but I'm happy to be provocative on this one. I didn't quite get the whole question, but I'll answer a question that I think it was to do with to do with regen. I think the regenerative movement is incredibly promising, and I think if they go on long enough, they'll invent organic farming.
I love that. Actually, if we're talking about provocative, one of the things that worried me in that question is back to the communities. I'm always really concerned when I hear back to the... Why aren't the communities with you? Why aren't you with the communities? This having to give back, I just question that. What was taken that now something has to be returned? Why wasn't this collaborative from the beginning? Why wasn't there an engagement all the way through? Those are the questions when oh, we're going to give back. Ooh, yeah. What left?
I think to some extent that stems from historical things again. So we're, the UK, we've reflected a little bit on that urban-rural divide. The UK is incredibly early in terms of becoming predominantly urban. So the word countryside emerges from at the same time as the moment more people are living in towns and cities, about 1850, than are living in the countryside, in rural context. We peripheralise land, nature, farming. We shove them off to one side. So that question of sort of re-engagement is really about that, isn't it? It's about subdividing people and saying these people aren't engaged because they're in urban contexts and these people are because they're in greener spaces, which of course is entire fiction. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that. But.
So just slightly more seriously, that was serious actually, and the regenerative movement has some very good ideas, including restoring soils, particularly, which of course was invented in the 1920s by the early organic movement. But it is the Soil Association has written a recent paper on this. Really just to state clearly that anything which has a regenerative label on it is meaningless because there is no legislation, there's no set of rules, there's no agreed standards or anything of that kind whatsoever. I'm not trying to be provocative, but this is simply the fact. And an example of this is that Waitrose no longer sells organic bread, which they used to. Now they sell something called Wild Farmed, and you can read it, and it's all full of wonderful words about butterflies and birds and how the farmers look after nature, but there are no standards. So it's completely meaningless. So buy organic.
I think we have time for just one more question.
I think his hand has been up for a very long time.
Thank you. The question of language has come up a few times, and this also is a question that probably sounds more provocative than I mean it to. But James, you mentioned nature as being this kind of sacred undergirding for why you follow an organic system, and I guess this is a question for everyone. What do we actually mean when we refer to nature, and is it something we need to leave unsaid because the systems of capital, being as rapacious as they are, will co-opt even that? But I don't think we actually spend enough time unpicking what we actually are talking about there.
I'll kick that off maybe while everyone else thinks about it. I'd encourage everyone to read Tom Oliver writing about I can't remember what the book is, but there's a book that he's written fairly recently which is about the boundedness of human bodies and the degree to which they actually have a great degree of flow with the world around them, whether bacterially or in terms of regeneration of cells and so on and so forth. I think we tend to think of ourselves as individuals and we tend to think of ourselves as social individuals, but those social connections reach far beyond. So I think the key thing I would like to point out is that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. So in this room, even though there isn't a vast green space full of wonderful beasts and birds and flora and fauna, there is a lot of nature going on, and we need to be part of that. How do you think about it, James?
This is a big subject. For me, I call myself a Rackhamite. In my degree, I studied the work of Oliver Rackham, and his principle of nature conservation was was very simple, really. That is that the management that created that habitat is the management you do to maintain that habitat. So I'm also a woodland manager. I manage a group of ancient woods in London. And so, you know, with woods you coppice them because that's what created that habitat. With hay meadows you cut the hay, and so on. However, you need a broader definition. So that is how we manage established habitats, and that's what, you know, we do in the Chilterns Conservation Board and what I do in my daily farming life and in other roles that I have on the. I'm a conservator of a group of commons as well. But we need a wider definition because, of course, most of our land has lost those specialised habitats. So really, nature, for me, as a practical land manager, is about managing land in ways that allow communities of plants to exist. And by communities of plants, I mean not random ones that might be created. I mean, if you conventional farming creates its own community of plants. You know, they're weeds that can tolerate herbicides, basically. But we need to recreate diverse habitats which are resilient because they have multiple species in them. I mean, that's a very simplified version of what nature is, but probably the best we can do in this timescale.
Thank you, James. That's, I'm afraid, all we have time for. I mean, do come and grab us afterwards. We'll be milling about for a minute or two if you have any further questions. I'm so sorry that Samwel wasn't able to dial in and join us. We'll have to reconvene next year and have another stab at getting him. I did almost pay for him to come across, but my capital fell at the last hurdle just before Christmas, so unfortunately he wasn't able to join us in person. Thank you all so much for your time and your generosity and your amazing questions. Thank you. Well done.